Good afternoon, and welcome to what I am confident will be an enlightening discussion and a unique opportunity to examine a defining and evolving national security concern. I'm glad you could all join us today. I'm Captain Scott Craverath, the commanding officer of the Naval ROTC program here at Vanderbilt, and on behalf of the university, who supports us, staff and midshipmen, spectacularly, and our Naval ROTC Alumni Association, whose work in support of the battalion has and continues to be instrumental in the health, well-being, and education of our midshipmen, and whose support for this event, our National Security Symposium, now in its 6th year, is simply indispensable. I want to thank you all for joining us today. This event has proven a remarkable success, tackling complicated issues, and it's directly in keeping with our mandate as an ROTC program to not only further the mission to educate and inform future Navy, Marine Corps, and Army officers, but also to link and engage our military, our university, and our community through enlightened examination and discussion of national security matters. I would also like to welcome this afternoon Rear Admiral Jabali. I think he made it in the audience. Sir. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, and our other distinguished military, civilian, and faculty members. I also need to acknowledge our NROTC Alumni Association President, Mr. Frank Walter, and Chairman Rear Admiral Jerry Brest, who's on stage and will facilitate a question and answer period after the General's discussion. Today I'm honored to introduce Lieutenant General Keith Huber as our guest speaker. I can tell you that since the General moved to our area about a year ago, following his retirement from the Army, he has injected himself into our community, speaking to multiple military and civic groups, as well as interacting and inspiring both our Navy and Marine Corps midshipmen and cadets, including this afternoon at lunch. The General's impressive biography is in your program, and I encourage everybody to read it. His 38 years of commissioned service speak directly to both the diversity and difficulty of assignments demanded in a modern Army career, as well as opportunities well seized. As former commander of the 10th Mountain Division and commanding general of U.S. Army South, the General's many assignments also include multiple Special Forces tours in Central and South America. His career personifies jointness, having served in multiple joint tours, as well as serving as the Deputy Commanding General of U.S. Joint Forces Command. For his final tour, he was the Commanding General in Afghanistan of Combined Joint Interagency Task Force 435, responsible for all U.S. law of armed conflict detentions. General Huber truly has a global perspective and broad experience. It is in his last 2 years in that remarkable journey for which we have asked the General to focus his remarks today, but with a depth of understanding and a perspective cultivated over 4 decades of diverse service. A native of Springfield, Ohio, Lieutenant General Huber graduated from the U.S. Military Academy in 1975, and his wife Shelley, luckily, has thankfully joined us this evening. Sir, welcome back to a place that I hope is starting to look fairly familiar to you. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome for Lieutenant General Keith Huber.
I'm going to move off the podium because I've learned that the only way that anyone would use the word brilliant associated with my name or actions would be the reflection off my complete forehead. And I don't know if I should thank you for the injection portion of this. I hope it's a vaccine and not typhoid. Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who are privileged to currently wear a uniform, for those of you who have worn a uniform of our armed forces, thank you for your selfless service and your dedication. For those of you who are of a military family, thank you for your sacrifice and your support, and you clearly represent our heroes. For those of you who have decided in the future you're going to wear a uniform, welcome, congratulations, and use every moment you have to prepare yourself for the privilege and the awesome responsibility of leading the sons and daughters of America. To the community leaders, to the academic leaders, thank you for your honorable profession, for your efforts as you inspire, encourage, shape the next generation of leaders to face the complexity and confusion and uncertainty of our world. What is next in Afghanistan? Well, I'd like to talk to the person who decided that would be the subject of today's discussion. You know, it's like people, as I submit myself to your interrogation after my remarks, you know, I've always gone, hey, there's no responsibility associated with a question. It's only with the answer. So I look forward to your interrogation if I ever stop talking. So let's talk about the context of my hopefully brief comments. The context of my comments are based upon my personal experience from July 2011 to July 2013, when I had the privilege to learn with and to lead an organization referred to as CJIATA 435, Combined Joint Interagency Task Force 435, who has been announced. We had the responsibility of all U.S. law of armed conflict detainee operations, of which a subset is the detention operations. This organization had militaries from other nations, from NATO participants. I had members from all of the services of the U.S. Armed Forces. I had diplomats. I had civilians from the interagency organizations within our government, and I had contractors. It was a very diverse group. So my comments are based upon that context during that time period, and with this duty responsibility, I had the opportunity and often the frustration of dealing with the senior leaders, both in and out of uniform, of multiple nations, specifically of the United States of America and the government of Afghanistan. With that context, now, some of you have different context. It may be based upon your service in Afghanistan. It may be based upon reading about Afghanistan. You may have done extensive research about Afghanistan. You may have written about Afghanistan. And so our context, our reality is going to be different. Reality is an interesting concept. It's an elusive concept. If you go to somebody who has some notoriety and you go to Webster, what does Webster define reality as? And Webster will tell you that reality is the way things actually are. Well, I'm a simple infantryman, but I'm not sure that's much of an assistance. The way things actually are. You could ask according to who, from what perspective, but it is at least the what. So let's talk about the what. Let's talk about the reality of Afghanistan. Let's talk about the terrain of Afghanistan. Rugged, arduous, mountainous, forbidding, compartmentalizing, valleys, ridge lines, extreme weather conditions, mountain passes frozen during the winter. With the geography naturally prohibiting movement, inhibiting communication, allowing the people of Afghanistan to not only be very hardy, very agriculturally based survivors, but the fact that they literally could live in a valley, in a tribal clan environment without any possibility or any desire to travel someplace else and interact with someone else. That all of the decisions, the security, the survival, the well-being was based upon the environment that they were in, the location they were in, their family, their clan, the power structure, the number of dialects, the number of languages, the inability to communicate, the education level, which, depending on what statistics you look at, would generously say that at least 85% of the Afghan population was illiterate, meaning that they could not read or write at a third grade level. So that's the reality. That's the what of Afghanistan. But to me, the what has never been the issue. Is as we try to discuss what is next for Afghanistan, I think the more difficult question, the more relevant question is the why. Not what has occurred, but how do you anticipate, I dare say not predict, but prepare yourself for the possibility, the likelihood, the probability of what might occur based upon why people do things. Why does someone think this? Why does someone say this? Why does someone act this way? I would submit to you that the way people think and act is a response to expectation management. Perhaps more distinctly towards expectation satisfaction. So all of us from the human dimension of life have expectations. I walk in here today, I got an expectation. I got an expectation that you as an audience will be courteous, that you'll be receptive, that you'll hang on my every word, that you won't fall asleep on me, and when I'm done, just out of sheer exhaustion, you'll applaud. You've got an expectation of me that I'll be engaging, I'll be energetic, I'll be enthusiastic, I'll be entertaining, that I won't make you go to sleep, that I won't talk too long. All of you walked in here looking at my bald head on the pamphlet and going, I got to see what a 3-star in the Army looks like. You walked in here with some impression of what I should look like, what I should sound like, how I should part my hair down the center. And so right now, you've graded me as to whether or not I've met your expectation. And based upon that, why, you're going to take some sort of action. You're going to have a response. You're going to go, this guy doesn't fit what I thought he should, and therefore I'm tuning him out. I'm finding some way to get up and leave. I pray he doesn't talk too long. Or you're going to go, wow, this is so much better than I thought it'd be, therefore I'm happy and I'm going to take a lot of notes because I don't expect that there'll be a quiz after this, but there will be. Our government has expectations. All American people have expectations. Our families have expectations. When I deployed to Afghanistan, my wife Shelley once again moved our family, our little girl and herself, without me. And she went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And people would come by the house, and they'd look at my daughter, and they'd go, where's your daddy? She'd go, Afghanistan. And far too many of those people, who, oh, by the way, were senior to me, said, oh, I'm sorry. And Alexis would look at Shelley, and she'd go, Mommy, why are they sorry? Daddy's a soldier. He's keeping us safe. He's taking care of the bad guys. Why are they sorry? And then they go, well, when's your daddy coming home? He left when I was 5. He'll be home when I'm 7. And when I'd been gone about 18 months, why, Alexis looks at Shelley one day and she goes, Mama, when's Daddy coming home? How many bad guys can there be? And nobody had the heart to say, unfortunately, there's an unlimited supply of bad guys who would steal our freedom and harm our precious families. But her expectations were not met by those responses, and they led to a confusion. Her expectations were shaped by her experiences of 5 years and immersion into the military culture. The inability of perhaps our government, clearly ourselves as individuals, the inability to have a cultural comprehension, the danger of that. And it's so much more than simply an ability to speak another language. There's so much more to being a linguist. Some people may not even understand what they refer to as the subtlety of the difference between interpretation and translation. They may interchange those when interpretation is of the spoken and translation is of the written word. And how many times I've seen documents between nations written in multiple languages, and someone with good intentions has done word-to-word translation, but the concept doesn't exist. The concept may not even exist in that culture, and governments sign agreements that to each of them say something entirely different, and so the expectations will not be satisfied, and people will respond to that. The easiest situation that I have to describe that is the Spanish language. So in English, when we talk about teasing someone, we talk about pulling your leg. If you were to take that word for word and say in Spanish, why people would look at you like, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, because that same concept of teasing, to joke with someone, in the Latin culture is to pull your hair. So it's very easy to go, nadie puede bromear conmigo porque nadie puede tomar el pelo de un calvo. So I can tell someone that not only I understand some words in Spanish, but I understand the context, the cultural meaning when I go, hey, you can't tease me because nobody can pull the hair of a bald man. So this inability to understand your behavior, your words in a cultural context is extremely dangerous. In another conflict, I ran into a scenario where I had vehicle accidents that were seriously injuring and killing my men and women. And the scenario was always the same. It would be a truck full of resupplies that was taking a left-hand turn into a forward operating base and being struck by the civilian vehicle that followed it, T-boning it and injuring the driver. And I looked at this and I said, okay, I'm going to change the distance between the trucks. I'm going to change how many trucks are in the convoy. I'm going to change the speed that they're driving. I'm going to change the time of the convoy. And nothing changed. And I kept having these accidents. And I finally went to one of the host military and I say, here's my circumstance. Why? Why is the what occurring? He looked at me and he goes, you don't understand. Your driving rules don't fit our cultural context. That here in this country, when you turn on your left turn signal, you indicate to the driver behind you that it's safe to accelerate and pass on the left. That lack of cultural comprehension killed American soldiers because the leader didn't understand how behaviors and actions were perceived in a different cultural context. In Afghanistan, the Afghan people to survive burned just about anything for heat and to cook. In the cases where we provided them with propane heaters, stoves, ovens, some of them had experience with propane, but most of them couldn't afford it, and you had the difficulty of a conflict ongoing, so the supply was not always consistent. And we watched propane heaters and propane stoves be disassembled while they took wood and built a fire. And sometimes that fire was inside of a facility which then also burned. As we looked at training the Afghan security forces to maintain equipment accountability, we found that a lot of the officers and the non-commissioned officers, because they could not read and write, could not do the serial number weapons inventory and maintain accountability. As I watched Afghan trials, that initially their system was based upon personal testimony, which could be influenced or could be purchased, or subjects' confessions, which could be coerced. Why we introduced and finally trained the judges and the lawyers to use evidence as a basis, and particularly forensic evidence. So we'd bring up fingerprints and DNA to be able to prove that the individual was involved, directly involved, facilitating an attack on U.S. or international forces. And I remember observing a trial where the lawyers and the judge got it, and the defendant had a weapon there that had 15 of his fingerprints on it, and he was going, "This is a falsehood. This obviously can't be my weapon because I only have 10. And so as you understood the cultural dynamics of that, as we looked at night raids by our Special Operations Forces, our Special Operations Forces conducted the very dangerous night raid, dangerous to themselves, because there ain't anything easy either underwater or at night. But we tracked the enemy to where they would stop for the night and conducted a night raid with the sole consideration of limiting civilian casualties and collateral damage. And in easily 85% of the night raids, the enemy was captured without firing a shot. Yet to the Afghan culture, this was absolutely unacceptable. To have someone enter the home of an Afghan without being invited, to have a non-Muslim force their way into an Afghan home, to the point that President Karzai dedicated a lot of effort to completely turn off the night raids, even though we did it for the right reason. The cultural perspective of who is the enemy. Al-Qaeda, Afghan Taliban, Haqqani, the neighborhood. To the Afghans, and on any given day within my detention facility, I averaged 28, 29, 3,000 detainees. That I personally, every night, reviewed the files of the circumstances of capture. That I personally signed my name for every one of those detainees using the Secretary of Defense's guidance of 2009 for law of armed conflict detention, which primarily said you were involved in the attack of 9/11, you facilitated or supported the attack of 9/11. You are a member of Al-Qaeda, and yes, some of the captures literally had membership cards. You were a member of the Taliban. You attacked a U.S. or international force in Afghanistan. You facilitated or supported an attack. And I would have the forensic data of fingerprints on improvised explosive pressure plates, of DNA on battery twists, of predator feeds, of people shooting. And so I guarantee you, the people that I signed my name for to then put them in law of armed conflict detention fit the criteria and were guilty of either having killed or attempted to kill U.S. or international forces. But to the Afghans, these were not the enemy. These were our wayward Afghan brothers that should be released if they then say that they won't cause any more trouble, and turn them over to the local village leadership, who would then monitor their activities to ensure that they didn't do anything like this again. And so the whole discussion of who is the enemy was from a cultural perspective. And from the Afghan perspective, the enemy was Pakistan. And any of the Taliban that came from Pakistan were the ones that were creating the issue. And so as we went to train and equip the Afghan National Security Forces, it wasn't until later that when they started making equipment requests, we thought we were preparing them to fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda within their borders, when in reality the true threat to them was Pakistan, and to ensure that they were not invaded by their neighbors. So let's go back to the what. Involvement in Afghanistan. U.S., international forces, Afghan leaders, Afghan government. And let's ask the question, why? Why the involvement? Well, from the U.S. and international members, it is a direct response to the attack of 9/11. To prevent Afghanistan from being a refuge, a point of leadership, a source of support or direction or participants for an attack against the U.S. or any of the international coalition members. From the Afghan perspective, it was to rid themselves of the oppressive grip of the Taliban and to create their own government and to gain their own capabilities and to receive assurances that the international community would not allow their neighbors to invade them. There was an expectation that everybody who was involved would agree on the task and purpose of the involvement. That didn't occur. And so the challenges became really three, in my opinion. What is success? How do you do a transition? And then sovereignty. So how do you define success? Because clearly there's an expectation that when you commit the lives of Americans and the financial power of our country, when you make that commitment, that there's an expectation that you're going to be successful. So how do you measure that? What criteria of effectiveness do you use? Do you go, okay, number of enemy leaders killed or captured, number of enemy soldiers killed or captured? Do you measure it by number of U.S. casualties decreasing? Do you measure it by number of international casualties decreasing? Do you measure it by number of Afghan security force casualties increasing, therefore showing that they're accepting more responsibility for the fight and they're taking it to the enemy? Do you measure it by amount of aid that comes in? Do you measure it by roads being rebuilt or bridges or wells being dug or schools or people attending schools or girls attending schools or girls in leadership positions or girls in the armed forces? How do you measure that success? And if you don't know what success looks like, then how do you get there? Well, most people would say to be successful, you got to have a transition. And most people view the concept of transition from a linear perspective. So, I'm doing this, it is good, that's why I'm doing it. And now I'm going to train and equip you to do this, and when you're ready, we're going to do it together. And then you're going to do it by yourself, and I'm going to lead. Interesting, when we started transitioning, planning, and let's just say there's 1,000 things that the international force was doing. And so success is, I'm going to take all these discrete 1,000 things and I'm going to find somebody else to do them. And when we really examined them, it was like, wow. If you really ask yourself a hard question and you go, why do I do things? Anybody goes to a new job and you go, okay, why are you doing that? Well, my predecessor did it. My boss told me to do it. My friend asked me to do it. I sort of know something about it, and God knows I don't want to learn how to do something new, so I'm going to do it. I sort of like to do it, you know. I'm wearing a uniform today, but I'm a banker when I'm not wearing a uniform, and so I want to work on banks. Or I got resources to do it, because why would I want to commit myself to do something that I don't have the resources to do, and my chance of being successful would be minimal? And so when you go to transition, and all of a sudden you transition it to somebody, and they go, nobody's told me to do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't have the resources to do that. It's not culturally acceptable for me to do that. And all of a sudden you find out that, gee, I'm doing 1,000 things, and I'm doing them for all the right reasons, and I'm only going to transition 25 of them. And you go, wow, somebody's probably going to give me a grade, but I'm not sure it'll get me advanced to the next phase of my life. Because then it comes to the question, well, why were you doing all these things? Or, worse than that, there was a term that I was happy was very short-lived. It didn't have a shelf life of a minute in my organization, but there was a term that people started saying, Afghan good enough. And I said, that's derogatory, that's demeaning, we will not use that. People do different things for different reasons. People have different capabilities. But don't come across to me that, gee, if you want to be good, be like me. And if you can't be like me, you're never going to be good. That arrogance is completely unacceptable. And then you talk about sovereignty. Because the longer you were there and in the transition, why you want the host nation to accept responsibility, to accept accountability, to demonstrate sovereignty. And some of that sovereignty may be that when you say, gee, I want to transition this, they go, no. Well, we need you to do this because it's in our interest. No. Well, how about showing us a little bit of appreciation for everything that we've sacrificed to support you? No. I mean, if you've read any of President Karzai's speeches, you will find the majority of them very absent of any recognition or appreciation for the lives lost or the resources provided. And in fact, if you read his last one, where he accused the U.S. of not allowing Afghans to have peace, that this war for the last 13 years was forced upon them by the U.S. and it was never in the interest of the Afghan people. So what is next for Afghanistan? I think understanding the why allows you a little insight into what our expectations could be. President Karzai refused to sign the bilateral support agreement. You had now President Ghani, Ashraf Ghani, a man that I know fairly well. I met with him and dealt with him on a regular basis my 2 years there. And Mr. Abdullah, who in the preliminary election, Mr. Abdullah gained more votes than Mr. Ghani did, but Mr. Abdullah didn't have the required votes to outright become the president. They had a secondary runoff, and all of a sudden, Mr. Ghani gained a significant larger percentage of the votes. Mr. Abdullah said, hey, this is fraudulent. I'm not going to accept it. We're going to break away. And you had a situation where President Karzai did not have someone to transition to. U.S. became involved. U.S. coordinated an agreement between Mr. Ghani and Mr. Abdullah that they would share power. Mr. Ghani is the president. Mr. Abdullah is chief executive officer, prime minister, title and responsibilities yet to be determined. So they're sharing power. They both signed the bilateral security agreement. Interesting point of reference is there is no such foundation, justification, explanation set of instructions within the Afghan Constitution of how you share power. In the Afghan culture, I will say that President Karzai's transfer of power to President Ghani is the first time that an Afghan leader who had power willingly relinquished power. In the culture, when you receive power, you hang on until someone removes your ability to hang on. So that is historically relevant. But I think we run the risk in a cultural perspective of being accused of interfering, meddling, coordinating an agreement that is not within the framework of the Afghan Constitution. What I learned about Afghan law is, first of all, and I constantly got accused by President Karzai of violating their constitution, so I read the critter. It's not very big. I didn't violate the Constitution in any term or technique. But what I learned about their law is their law authorizes. So our law, you typically hear people go, well, it's not against the law, so I'm going to do it. They're the reverse side of that coin. So if their law doesn't tell them they can do it, why they go, we can't do it. That's why it was so important to have written documents and written agreements, because if it wasn't written down, and oh, by the way, it better mean the same in Pashto as it does in English. If it wasn't written down, they felt no obligation to follow through on it. Even when it was written down, why? They didn't necessarily feel an obligation. They didn't feel a commitment to a non-Muslim to do that. So we've got a sharing of power of the Afghan government that is outside of their constitution, and that they themselves don't know how these two political opponents are then going to come to an agreement. We have a bilateral security agreement, which means that at least for the next 2 years, you will have a U.S. and international military presence who will advise and assist in the sustainment. How much assistance and at what level? Will it be enough to give us a situational awareness? Will we really know what is happening in Afghanistan? Will we be able to go back to the original why of why we got involved in Afghanistan to prevent Afghanistan from being a launch point or a refuge for evil people that would attempt to harm our nation? Or not, remains to be seen. There will be a funding stream that will support the Afghan government for at least the next 2 years. So is that success? What are the expectations? What does the U.S. expect now out of this agreement? I think the U.S. may be referencing what occurred in Iraq and going, because we didn't have a presence at all, why then it allowed things to occur that perhaps we weren't aware of, perhaps we could have advised, assisted, perhaps we could have influenced someone to stop it. But I'm not sure what our expectations are, other than we are still there, we are still assisting. And now that, at least in my opinion, the Afghan perspective is to protect themselves against their neighbors. And now that the Afghan detainees that during my term were there, that now have been turned over to the Afghans, and I suspect the majority of them have been released. And I suspect if you do the forensics, why you will find similar fingerprints in current attacks. And so now, as you think your way through what your expectations are of what is next for Afghanistan and the involvement, and as you look at your cultural perspectives and talk to our leaders about what you expect and how do you measure that, And how do you determine if it's the right thing to do and if it's successful? Before I open myself up for the pleasure of interrogation, I'd like to just end with a comment. During my 2 years there, I came home 3 times. Came home 11 days the first year. My father's been gone for over 11 years, but my mother died while I was there, so I came home to be with my mother, and then I came home an 11-day period after that. And so after I had returned, I was having a significantly bad day, and I probably had a couple of those. And so being the devious individual that I am, why I go, by golly, I need a morale boost. So how do I, the 3-star general walking around, get my morale boosted? How do I pull on somebody's tongue without being obnoxious to get a compliment? So I went up to one of my great sailors in my joint organization. And my plot was, this sailor probably doesn't know that Congress limits the number of generals or flag officers, admirals, and all the services. And it's separated by number of stars. So, for example, in the Army, there's 312 limit. And by law, over half of them have to be 1 stars. And then on any given day, you got 125, 135 2 stars, and you got 35 or 43 stars, and you got 8 to 10 4 stars. So here was my concept. I was going to ask this great sailor how many generals are in the Army, and he was going to give it profound thought, and then he was going to go 1,100. And I go, aha! It's only 312 of us. We work really hard. You should appreciate us more. So, this was my motive. I was absolutely convinced it was going to work. So I asked him, how many generals in the U.S. Army? And the response was immediate. Too many. But what a lesson in humility. What a tremendous response. Because I suspect nobody in this room got up this morning and said, I think I'll go into work and convince everybody that I'm an idiot. Let me go into work and convince people that I'm selfish, that I don't care about them, that I'm unprofessional. I mean, who really wants to be part of that group of the too many? And so I try my best. My concern, particularly every time I've gone into combat, is, will I hesitate? Will I make a bad decision? Will I allow the fear and chaos and horror of combat to cause me to hesitate to make a decision, and the men and women that I serve will suffer because of it? And so my concern was, at what point do I reach where I mentally and physically am not worthy to serve these men and women? And that point has always motivated me. That I try my best not to have somebody go, wow, they really do promote people out of curiosity. If you were a 3-star, I could be a 5-star tomorrow. Are you kidding me? I never want to be counted in that group of too many. And so I hope with your patience today that you won't walk out of this auditorium and go, hey, I just met one of those too many general officers. Thank you. Admiral, I'm at your beck and call.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've had a great opportunity to hear not only philosophy and history and experience, but also how to go about analyzing what your job ought to be and what your relationship should be
General. My name is John Goodell. I'm a 04 graduate at Vanderbilt, Army ROTC graduate. I really geeked out when I saw that you were the speaker because you and I were in Afghanistan at the same time. I was there for all of 2012 as the judge advocate for detention operations for that night special operations task force that you mentioned. I want to ask a couple of questions about, and you kind of alluded to it, about the way forward and what we could have done differently, and sort of your take on turning over detention operations to the Afghans. Is there a way we could have done that better? When I was going through it, it felt like we were not doing it as well as we could have. And also, you know, and this is out in the news and the print media, what about the high value detainees, not the farmer? What's the way forward, you know, in your perspective as a retired Army officer?
Thank you. Thank you for your service. The whole subject of law of armed conflict detainee operations is a very sensitive topic. And as I said, a subset of that is the actual detention portion of that. And in my organization, I thought I had a law firm. I mean, I had more lawyers there that were doing great work that was a great education for me because I hadn't been exposed to that density before. And I applauded every one of them, regardless of what level of experience they were. They all felt a fierce obligation to give me a legal opinion. And I'm going, hey, you know, your duty title has advisor on it. My duty title has commander on it. And so if I need your advice, I will ask you. However, if I do not, feel free to alert me as to how I'm missing things. And then I could never make a decision that I didn't have a lawyer who disagreed with it, you know, and I could hear them muttering under their breath, that general is so misguided. Yeah, obviously doesn't understand my brilliance, and he should have done what I wanted him to do. And then from my special ops community who every night risked their lives to capture evil people rather than kill them, to then turn them over with circumstances of capture that I and I alone had the responsibility to sign my name for. And I had several phone calls from special forces, special operations, SEALs, warriors that I admired and had served with who felt that I had betrayed them. And I said, hey, look, I got it. I've been there. I understand the risk. I understand the cost. But I'm the guy that's got to be convinced, and without being disrespectful, just because you capture them doesn't mean I agree with it, and I'm the only one that the Secretary of Defense holds accountable for who's being detained. Now, I talked about an option. The purpose of law of armed conflict detention is to give our men and women in harm's way an option. You have got to have an option to simply kill. That's not who we are as a people. That's not who we are as an institution. If your men and women go out there and the only thing they can do when they encounter the enemy is kill them, regardless of the circumstances, that is wrong. That is morally wrong. So you come up with the unpleasantries of law of armed conflict detention, whose purpose is that you remove enemy from the battlefield, you detain them. You detain them in an internationally legal framework. But it is not a legal process. And so you detain them until the end of the conflict, until you're no longer there to be their pop-up targets, and then you release them. That is the essence of law of armed conflict detention. And you have a review process. I mean, I had been exposed in other missions. I remember commanding U.S. forces in Kosovo, and I had the International Red Cross. But in this job, wow. And to me, the International Red Cross is the international conscience. I have such a respect for the difficult tasks that they do, but on any given month, 10, 12 days of that month, they were inside my detention facility. They spent hours talking to me. We didn't always agree. I mean, I constantly got written up. I probably should have done my homework a little better to figure out that they reported back to the U.S. Secretary of Defense and the President. I probably should have figured that out before I got the note from the SecDef that goes, hey, Keith, whatever you're doing with the Red Cross, it's good. Keep doing it. Sir? What are you talking about? And I always had a conflict because the people who would come into the detention facility would want to go inside the cell. And I had, in most cases, cells that held 28 to 34 Taliban, Al-Qaeda, evil people. And they wanted to go in and interview them in the cell. And I said, absolutely not. Well, we do it in other countries. Congratulations. But I am not going to put you at risk. I'm not going to put my guard force at risk. I'm not going to put the detainees at risk so that you can go in there and mingle with people that I know are evil. So I can bring them to a separate room and you can interview them, or you can interview them cell side, but you are not going inside. So there were several times that members of Congress and our senior Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, came and talked to me about the detainees. I constantly had people go, well, you know, can't we just give the Afghans a couple? I mean, don't you have any low-hanging fruit? I went, wow, you know, I don't run a bloody orchard. I know who these people are. You have created a system where I'm hand-receipted for every one of them. And so I take that responsibility extremely seriously, and these are all dangerous people. Now, you can argue. I mean, even you talked about the farmer, okay? So the distinction between the individual who makes the improvised explosive device versus the individual who literally digs the hole and put it in, based upon the individual who is the observer who then detonates it, all of those people in that chain of custody facilitated an attack which resulted in the death and injury of U.S. and international forces. So I don't distinguish that there. Now, you know, what you don't know, once again, you know the what. What you don't know is the why. I mean, why did they do that? Did that farmer do that because he had to have the money to support his family? Did that farmer do that because the Taliban said, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill your family? Did the farmer do that because in a U.S. or international airstrike their family was killed? I mean, you don't know the why, which to me is the important aspect to be able to predict whether or not, if you release them, they will return. I mean, the CIA and the Department of State always used to use a term called recidivism. You know, and being a simple infantryman, I didn't know what that meant. So I went to Webster. And lo and behold, I then erroneously, foolishly, wisely consulted my lawyers, and they went, Webster ain't good enough, General. You got to have Black's Law Dictionary. So I went on Amazon. Boy, even the abridged, used copies are expensive. So I got Black's Law Dictionary. But where people were talking about the rate of recidivism, well, in my mind, they were using the wrong term, because a recidivist is a career criminal. Now, that may have been true in Afghanistan if I turned over a detainee to the Afghan legal system, which did have criminal code that if you use explosives, if you kill somebody, if you have an unregistered weapon, why part of the way that I could give the Afghans their sovereignty with people who were evil is I could fit it into their legal system, and if I could then have a possibility, probability that based upon their law and the forensic evidence that they would be convicted and put in an Afghan jail for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, why then that was an acceptable measure in my mind to prevent them from returning to the battlefield and trying to kill us again. It reached a point, not while I was there, but it reached a point where President Karzai said, you can't do any more detentions. Well, I was in a meeting with him where he said that, and our response was, then we've got to stop combat operations because we cannot send our men and women out to the field going, you can't capture anybody, all you can do is kill them. So I did have a meeting with him during my 2-year period there, but there was a point of negotiation and sovereignty where Afghan detainees, which clearly had evidence that they were involved in attacks, were then presented to the Afghans. And in numerous cases, the Afghan court system said, lack of evidence, or you're guilty, but time served, and released them. Now, you also had foreign fighters. You had people from other countries that had crossed the border and been involved. And you had what was referenced to high-value targets, which were senior leaders of Haqqani, primarily Al-Qaeda, Taliban, that we felt still had the connections and the ability to, if released, plan and perhaps a direct attack against the United States. And so how would I have done it different? And in the privilege to serve for my entire adult life up to last September, 38 years in uniform, I never asked for a job and I never turned one down. But by golly, knowing what I know now after that 2 years in Afghanistan, I might have broken that mold. I don't know how I would have done it differently. I know that when I was there, I was given the latitude to say no. When people told me that I needed to release people or do something in the transition to the Afghans, I was given the latitude to say no. I was also, when I said no, willing to submit my resignation, and in one case I did. Because I felt that strongly about it. And I had the ability to go, okay, I'm the only one who's signing his name around this. I mean, one of the things you learn at senior levels is there's not a lot of documentation that's provided. Gee, you want to give that to me in an order? No. Okay, can I take a note? No. Can I reference this discussion? No. And so, very often, without being dramatic or emotional, but I mean, being a soldier is an affair of the heart. When you lead people at times to their death, why, it's an emotional event. But I was able to say, okay, which one of you leaders is going to explain to the family of this individual that we released them and they came back on the battlefield and attacked your loved one and killed him when we had them? So, I mean, and I know during my 2 years in Afghanistan, I mean, you know this, we recaptured people or confirmed identities every time we could with those who were killed, and found people that had been either at Gitmo or within the Afghan legal system turned over by the detention facility that had then returned to the battlefield. So it was a fascinating, frustrating, difficult job that I felt that the men and women that I served within 435 did an incredible job at. But boy, I don't know how I would have improved it.
On the point side, did you have another question?
No, sir. I'm just providing the microphone, sir. Yes, sir.
General Michael Jabley, thank you so much for coming to speak. You spoke about the 1,000 good things that you were doing, and then the need to man, train, and equip the Afghans to be able to do that themselves, and then to transition to them doing that. And whether it's 1,000 things or 25 things, it would seem that the metric to be able to do that is, are they ready to do it on their own? However, in this case, we define that metric in part as getting it done by a date certain. Can you talk about that and what difficulties that presented to you?
Yes, Admiral. As I'm trying to figure out how to answer that, it's always good. And thank you for the question. What a great question. You know, your terminology of were they ready to accomplish that takes on a different reality. Because, once again, the expectation is if we go through a screening selection process, if we then train you in the skill and we provide you the equipment, then you will have the willingness and the leadership and the orders to pursue the task in a like fashion. Because once again, we're going, if we're doing this, then you better be doing this, and that's the only way I can transition it, without having the cultural comprehension that in most scenarios, the Afghan leadership, either of the security forces or of the local villages, out of a question of survival, historically, had agreements with anybody who came into town. So to think that they didn't have an agreement to hedge the bet if the Taliban returned was not the way that they were protecting their population. And so it was interesting as we tried to track down, particularly when we faced an increase in the Afghans killing us, in the people we were advising killing us, and we went through the intel and go, boy, can we talk to people? Can we figure out who's talking to the Taliban, who's talking to Haqqani, who's being motivated to then either infiltrate or turn against us as we're trying to advise them and they're shooting us? You found out when you examined who talked to who, that there were a whole lot of people talking to Taliban and talking to Pakistan and talking to Haqqani. And so you couldn't use that as a metric. You know, and I won't compare this to Iraq because it's a completely different scenario, but you look at what's going on in Iraq, and you've got a military force that has U.S. equipment that was trained to use it by the U.S., and then you could question their willingness to stand and fight and to stand and die. I mean, this expectation management was that, like our armed forces, whether they agree with where they are or why they're there, our armed forces are willing to die, primarily for each other, but they're willing to die, just like our American people. Even though less than 1% of the American population wears a uniform, regardless of the politics of the decision, there is an absence of disagreement amongst the American public that they will support our men and women in harm's way, that they rally with the support of the sacrifice of military families. So I think the special ops community had the most success with training the host nation. And then those host nation, those Afghan special ops, then were fought for with the conventional forces and were limited at the presidential level as to what they could accomplish. Now, I didn't have the context of being the small unit leader working day by day with the Afghan National Security Forces, so I can't really tell you with accuracy how willing they were. I can tell you that the people who trained them, when Dan Bolger was there coming out of being the G3 of the Army, and he was responsible to train the Afghan Army and police force, I can tell you he trained them to be proficient in the equipment that was provided. But the willingness as to whether they were ready to do that or whether they will do it in the future, because it became apparent to Dan later on as they were asking for equipment and fighters that really had no role within Afghanistan, and our expectation that they would ensure that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda would not use Afghanistan as a launch point. It became obvious to us that they were concerned with border infringements by Pakistan. And then you sort of go, wow, that's not why we're giving you all this stuff. We're giving you all this stuff to do this for us so that we don't have to do it here. Yes, sir. Oh, you're a generous crowd. Sort of dull, but generous.
Thank you, General. My question's about Pakistan. You've talked about how the Afghanis, from your perspective, saw Pakistan as the enemy, but what exactly or who within Pakistan did they see as the enemy? My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's not really a national Afghani identity in the way that we have here in the United States. So is it Pakistan as a whole, the folks down in Islamabad? Is it the folks and the tribes in the frontier? Is it ISI or the friends of ISI, shall we say? I mean, which kinds of entities are we talking about? Or is it all of them?
Thank you. During my 2 years in Afghanistan, why the senior U.S. military in Pakistan was a dear friend of mine, a fellow Green Beret, Lieutenant General Ken Keane, and he'd come over frequently from Pakistan to brief us on what was going on. My impression, formulated by talking to the Afghan generals, the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Minister of Defense, listening to President Karzai, is there was not a specificity to certain people in Afghanistan being the enemy. And clearly the Afghan units that were on the border with Pakistan, you constantly had field artillery issues where, borders are tough anyways, but when you can't delineate the borders, and when you don't have maps that come to an agreement as to where the borders are, why then you run the risk of, gee, I got an outpost here, hey, it's in my territory, I'm going to shoot artillery at you. And so it is a great opportunity for people to be killed and to have governments protest each other. And that really, so you had the physical incursion of Taliban out of Pakistan, and you had periodic, though regularly periodic, artillery and mortar shelling across wherever you thought the border was, and the requirements to withdraw outposts. But it was more of a general, gee, the Pakistan government is against us. Pakistan has always wanted to reclaim Afghanistan. This is the issue. You need to ensure, U.S., that you protect us if Pakistan strikes us. And so, I mean, I remember one instance where I unfortunately presented the grim statistics of casualties, because the comment had been made that, gee, if you weren't here, if you infidels weren't here, why, we wouldn't have any Taliban attacks. And so once you leave, why, our Afghan brothers will regroup. and we'll be fine. And I had the unenviable task of, okay, let me take this month's casualty figures, and let me tell you the brutal facts of at least what we know. And the casualties of the brave Afghan National Security Forces were 4 times as many in this given month as U.S. and international forces. That the casualty figures of innocent Afghan women and children were 6 times as much. So don't tell me that they were shooting at us and everybody else was collateral damage. That how can you call these your Afghan brothers when they are killing more of you than they are of us? And the comment was, well, these are fighters from Pakistan. These are not Afghan Taliban. And it is in the best interest of Pakistan to destabilize our government. I mean, you could ask the rhetorical question of, are we in Afghanistan because Afghanistans are important, or are we in Afghanistan to ensure that it's a secure area and you don't have a destabilizing factor for Pakistan with nuclear capability? I mean, you could take that conspiracy theory to another level as well.
Thank you very much.
Oh, Admiral, you saved me. I always sort of worried. I mean, I believe in the joint environment, but when I found out an admiral was going to control how many questions I answered, thank you, sir.